down to it. A lot of the retouching work is about painting, and you have to practice your tablet or mouse painting technique, whether you're a skilled painter or you're not. If you're not usually in the habit of painting and drawing, this will take a lot of practice. But even if you have some experience of drawing or painting on paper, doing it in Photoshop is different. The best way of getting a picture of how the brushes work is to make a blank new document. Here I'm creating a white A4 size document at 300 ppi. That's roughly equivalent to a US letter size. Painting with black brushes on this will give us a good idea of how a paintbrush responds to various opacities and flows, and how size and softness settings interact. Let's first get an overview of how the brushes work. I'm going to start with a 19, that's a hard brush, and as you see there, it's not very big. You see its preview here in the brushes. This is the actual brush panel. Now I can make it bigger on the master diameter there, or I can go in the image itself and tap the square brackets next to the enter or return. I can also use the Control Alt or Control option on my Mac and drag this sideways. To the left it gets smaller, to the right it gets bigger. So I'm going to go to about here, and this is a completely hard brush, no airbrush, and I'm going to set this to 100% and use a black colour there. Just doing a simple stroke there. You can see that this is a bit wobbly, it has these rounded edges, and that's because the brush isn't actually a smooth entity, it's lots of little circles. If we take the flow down to 30%, you can actually see these little rings here. Now that's with a hard brush. If I did this with a soft brush, you wouldn't see the rings. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I've now taken the opacity down to 30% and the flow is back to 100. And to compare these two, I've just dragged here. And of course you get a grey, which is a semi-opaque stroke. Now let's go to a soft brush without any airbrush. I'm just going to take a 35 soft there, and it's not on airbrush. You see that when that is white or clear, it's not on the airbrush. And I'm going to make this now bigger. In CS5 I can actually make this harder edged by dragging up or down. Now I'm going to set that back to 100% and do a single stroke there, and you can see that this falls off at the edges. Now I'm going to make this 30% flow and drag a stroke there. Now if you compare that with the one with all the circles, that's exactly the same flow. The only difference is that we've now got a soft brush. You will notice one thing though, you've got actually a point here on the brush, and that's because of the shape dynamics. So I'm going to turn that off and stroke again, and you see there that this time you didn't get that point. On 30% opacity, it behaves slightly differently from the flow. On the flow, it's slightly harder, it's slightly darker as well, and a low opacity gives it slightly less impact. Now starting on a new file here, a new document, I'm going to test out the airbrush, and you see the size of the cursor before I start brushing in. I'm going to brush in with black at 100%. And this is one stroke, or rather it's not a stroke, I'm just holding it down, and you see how it's bleeding outside the size of the brush, and the longer I hold it, the more it expanded. Turning the airbrush off, I'm going to do the same thing, and now you see no expansion. Of course, if I make another stroke here, you see a little bit of expansion there. But there's a big difference between the airbrush on and off, and when you work with the airbrush, you've got to be aware of your speed with the brush. Another thing to be aware of is the size. I'm going to just turn my airbrush back on again and making that smaller. You can see here that this, although it's the same brush, essentially it's the same brush, I haven't picked a new brush, it's much harder edged, and I'm going to go smaller and even smaller, and now you see effectively what you've got is quite a hard brush here. So a big soft brush is always softer than a small soft brush, just because it's got more fall off. Now let's go bigger again, and let's set this to 30% flow and 30% opacity. Now this tends to be my favorite setting. Now for working in masks and revealing things such as skin, for example, this is a great brush here. And you see here how it builds up very nicely. The only thing to look out for really is these rings or these bands here. And you may have to put noise in your masks. You can also, of course, go on the brush settings here and set noise in there, as I've done with a couple of my brushes. I use them interchangeably. Sometimes I use noise, sometimes I don't. I use noise when I think there's a danger of banding. I tend to not use noise if I think the noise is actually going to be visible, because there is no setting on the noise, it's just on or off. Now I want to go back to one little thing here. I'm just going to set the flow to 100%. Doesn't really matter if I'm working with flow or opacity for what I'm going to show you now. Although when I drag 1, 2, 3, I'm not anywhere near 100%. I'm just going to take the brush picker away here a little bit and just show you here that you've got values of 88 if I look in the info panel, and that's very, very far from black. Black is 0. So I'm just going to carry on brushing. So I did 3 strokes, 4, 5, 6 strokes, again using the eyedropper and looking at it, and now we have 31 in the info. So at 6 strokes you still haven't actually built it up to 100%. So just be a little bit aware that if you really want 100% opaque, you may not get it even if you do the maths right. You may have to check with the info panel and make sure you get that absolutely right. Going back to our brushes here, one last thing. The other dynamics has an opacity jitter and a flow jitter. I'm coming back to this in CS5 because in CS5 you have something called transfer instead of other dynamics. Pretty much the same thing, but a bit busier. It's got a few more things in it. But just to note that if you're working with a tablet, you can then set the opacity jitter and the flow to pen pressure and you get a different kind of stroke. You can also set how much jitter. Jitter is basically irregularity. How much irregularity. Now you don't want a lot of it because you can get these bits of fluff here, and really what you want most of the time is quite regular brushes that you can actually predict. Predictable brushes are much better, believe me, when you're retouching than ones that do their own thing. Now that we've covered the real basics, let's get into some tablet work and the brush dynamics. I've skipped over to CS5 where I've made a nice set of preset paintbrushes, which you can also use. I doubt there's a single professional retoucher out there who retouches with a mouse. The paint work we do is by nature very fluid and also pressure sensitive, so you can't get fluid movements with a mouse. Because although you can drag with a mouse, it's designed as a clicking instrument which only operates with an on and off action. I use Wacom Intuos tablets, both versions 3 and 4. And unless you're a trained painter who also paints with a whole arm, there's no need really for the largest tablet. If you paint from the hand like I do, you can use a medium or even a small tablet. It's what you get used to that matters. And of course, other brands are available. Don't get me wrong, you're not expected to make a painting as you retouch, but you should be able to control a brush. So I thought I'd show you the workings of some of my brush presets by painting an eye with a little help of some selections. I really do recommend that you replicate this exercise. I'm sure that a lot of you can do better than me. Starting with a completely grey document, we're going to pick from the presets an oval eye brush. As you can see, this brush actually has an oval shape to it. You can angle the brush as much as you like. You've also got some scattering on it with pen pressure. Transfer in CS5 is pretty much the same as other dynamics in previous versions of Photoshop. As controls for this, I have opacity jitter set to pen pressure, flow jitter set to pen pressure, and the values there are set so that the brush falls off nicely on the edges and you don't get these pointy edges, you get a round edge here. We also have noise and airbrush, and it's set to smoothing. These are uncontrollable, they're just on and off. Now I'm going to load the eye white mask just to work with my slightly feathered selection here. I'm now on the inner eye layer and I'm picking a colour just a little bit brighter than the grey colour that we've got here all around. And I'm now just setting the brush size, and I'm doing that by pressing Control Alt on my Mac here and dragging the brush sideways. And I'm just brushing in just a little bit with this colour, just giving it about halfway pressure there. It does fall off to the sides, but pretty much it covers the whole area. Again, I go to the presets and pick a brush, and this one's for the iris. So I'm now on the iris layer, and the brush looks like this. It has lots of noise in it, actually. It has the noise turned on, and you really see the noise on this one. It is an airbrush, and it's set to smoothing as well, and both controls that are set to pen pressure. I'm loading the iris selection, which is also feathered, and just making the brush a little bit bigger, just using the brackets this time, and painting that in there. As you can see there, it falls off from the middle. Now I want to work on the iris with a much smaller brush, so I'm picking now an iris brush from my presets there. And this one's a bit irregular. It's a very small brush, and I'm just starting out, just getting a feel for this pattern. And remember that I have a selection here, although the selection is hidden. I've pressed Command H here to hide my selection so it doesn't get in the way. I feel that I need a pupil in here so I can visualize what I'm doing. So I go to the pupil layer and I pick myself another kind of brush, which is an opaque semi-hard brush there. I'm just painting in there, 2 clicks really, just not dragging the brush at all there, just clicking it. Now I'm back on the iris layer and I'm keeping on there. As I can see there, I've actually got the pupil just a little bit off center, but I can rectify that later. I can just pull that a little bit over. The strange thing here in CS5 is that there is a little bit of a lag on the brushes, as you can see here. I don't know why that is, but it is so you really got to watch out for that, so you don't paint any further than you need to. That means that you have to have quite a lot of confidence as well as you paint. What I'm doing really is just scribbling with the brush there, just scribbling away from the outside in really, and changing direction sometimes as well, because then your hand has a slightly different movement and you get a little bit of crisscrossing, which is actually what you want. You don't want too much perfection here. That would look completely artificial. So you can think of it as dragging from the center outwards or from the outside and in. Now the way that you'd normally work with this when you're actually retouching is that you would use it to dodge and burn, to make an eye a little bit sharper, to make the iris a bit sharper. I'm just zooming out a little bit here and picking a new brush, and this time it's an airbrush, and I'm still on this layer, and I'm going to just use a 30-30 airbrush to darken around the edges a little bit. As you see, I'm using black there if you look at the foreground swatch. Most eyes are a little bit darker on the iris around the edge, so we're just deepening that a little bit. I can even do more later on. And remember, I've got my selection, so all I need to do here is just skim it. I'm going into the middle of the eye, and of course I'm working below the pupil there and using white there to lighten it a little bit. I'm deselecting now and going to the catchlight layer. I've got a special brush here for the catchlight. It's just a really hard brush. Catchlight is never soft, and it's just completely irregular. And the whole point of it is to just quickly dab with it, not trying to make a long stroke. We're moving on to the upper lid, and I'm loading my selection there. Probably not a very perfect selection, and this is a very stylized eye. I'm going to use an airbrush there and just skim with the airbrush from the top. I've hidden my selection, and you'll see here that you get a little bit of darkening there at the top, And I'm also putting some light in, just Xing my swatches there to get a little bit of light, and then X again to get black, and just skimming that edge. We're going to put some lashes in here later, and that will obviously also darken it down, but for this I just want this as a good base really for my lashes. I don't want to overwork this upper lid. Now we're going to go to the lower lid, and I'm loading its selection there. Command click to load that selection, and first I'm just going to paint a little bit with white, just to create a sort of basis for, you know, you have some highlights there normally. It's going to be darkened though, so I X my swatches and just paint with a smaller brush, still an airbrush. It was based on this 3030 opacity and flow airbrush, and just using that to skim that edge a little bit, hopefully not taking away all the white that I put in there. You can kind of fiddle forever with the upper and lower lid just to get it right, strengthening a little bit more on the upper lid there and making it ready for the lashes, which is the next thing that we're going to be working on now. So we're going now to an eyelash brush, which has a little bit of fall off. It's a very small brush at 3 pixels. It has a flow of 32 and an opacity of 100. And I'm just painting some guide lashes here. My first lashes are very important, so I go quite slowly on these. And this is real time, and the process is going to be speeded up as we go later on. I'm not going any below the lashes. It is allowed to undo if you get something wrong. I'm making very straight lashes here. I'm not really going into the eye. Later on I'll be going a little bit down before I go up. So just the middle here is sometimes a bit hard. I tend to paint from each side and into the middle. In the middle they go in different directions, so you have to be a bit careful there. Now I can start working a little bit rougher and harder. Also I'm shaping it a little bit more down before it goes up. As you know, lashes do go down before they go up again. My pen pressure here is just medium, I'd say. So the lashes are not fully black, but remember they are on a separate layer, so if you need to darken them down you can actually do so, either with a burn or actually a curve on it. I don't like lashes that fall off too much. Mascaraed lashes tend to not fall off at all. They tend to be a bit clumpy, and there is actually a slight built-in clumpiness to this lash brush, but because it's so small you can't see the clumpiness. It is there though, so it's as irregular as it can possibly be. Sometimes I just have to go back a few steps, Option Command Z, and go back a few steps and redo it. There's no shame in going back. You've got to get these lashes right. It's very hard to pick one lash out later on and remove it. We are going to go a little bit on the edges here with an eraser. Now obviously the whole point of this is not to make a painting, it's to get practice on how to fill in eyelashes that are already there. Now I'm painting completely freehand. I'm not even looking at an image here, so this is complete fiction. The whole point of this is really just to get practice in how to paint, how to use the brush, how to use your hand as you're creating these lashes, making sure you don't make spiders that look too regular and not too irregular either. Now as I move on, I'm speeding up the process, and I'm also speeding up the recording just a little bit just to get on with it, but most of this, what you've seen here, has been in real time, and it is actually a good thing to be able to work quite quickly. If you work too slowly you may overthink it a little bit too much, and you won't be able to really let go at the end. My technique really is to just press quite hard at the base of the lash and then lighter at the end of the lash. Now I'm going to take the eraser, I'm just going to the eraser presets there, and I'm just going to choose there an airbrush and just get rid of some of the lashes that are a bit too long there. Now they are a little bit soft, but I think that can work here. We're not going for this heavily mascaraed look. It's great, isn't it, when you can make it up entirely. Okay, we're now going to go to the lower lashes, working very carefully, and I've taken this brush down to a size of 1 pixel, going very carefully there and putting in some very light lower lashes, shorter towards the inner corner. And now I'm going to speed up this a little bit, so we're going to move on to the finished set of lower lashes there. Well, probably finished. And we're now going back a little bit to work a bit more on the inner eye. I'm going to load the selection again for the inner eye, and I'm back on that layer. And I'm now going to work in a little bit of shadow. When you've got eyelashes, you will always have a bit of shadow in the eye, and also shape the eye a little bit better. Just putting in a little bit of shape in the corners and around the edges, so that you get this spherical shape to it. There's a lot of doing and undoing. I do a stroke, I assess it, whether to undo it or accept it. For each stroke, I have a little look. I'm probably going to come back to this and work even a little bit more on this, so it's good to walk away from it and come back later and just assess it again. Now we're going back to the iris, and I'm just putting in a little bit of shadow below the eyelashes there on the iris, just to get that same feeling there, and back again to the inner eye, just putting a little bit more shadow there. I could go on and on doing this work. There are obviously some time constraints on doing this for you, so I'm going to revisit this and show you what I end up with later on. Now what we've got here is a very stylized eye, and again I have to emphasize that you won't be called upon to actually create an eye from scratch when you're retouching. It's more a case of knowing your brushes, working with the right brushes, having the right brush technique, and when you're dodging and burning or painting on a mask, you can then be confident about the brushes that you're using. And brush confidence isn't something that's going to come naturally from the start. Unless you've got some experience of painting in Photoshop, you're not going to get it before you've put in a fair few hours, days, weeks, months, possibly years doing this. I've now got a skin layer here. In fact, I'm going to just delete this layer and make it from scratch again. So I've deleted the layer and Shift Command N to make a new layer, which I'm going to call skin. And using the soft light and fill with neutral colour grey. And now we're going to take an airbrush with a little bit of noise, I think, just to avoid creating any banding on this flat grey layer. This is completely, again, it's absolutely and totally from my imagination. I'm going here just to create a little bit of a shade, and this would be more similar to what you're doing when you're dodging and burning or doing a shading layer. I'm just working with my black and the white, and you can look at the shading tutorial. You can also look at the dodge and burn tutorial to just get an idea of this. I'm now moving on to the final version here of this eye in a bit of context here, and what I've done with it is basically just given it a slight catch light, and I've given it a bit more shading there overall. Just finally going back to my tool presets. Now tool presets aren't actually new tools, they are just settings for the tools, and I'm just going to go through the ones that I've used here. First of all, I started out with this oval eye brush. I then went on to the iris with an airbrush just to create a base. I'm going to zoom in here so I can actually find this very subtle iris brush that I used here, which is this one. This is one stroke with the iris brush, and you can see here how very, very subtle this is. I then went on to create a pupil using this semi-hard edge brush, which is completely opaque and black. I then used a catch light. Let me see if I can find that. Okay, I've put that against black here, but this is the catch light brush. Just 3 different strokes of that here. I did use the airbrush quite a lot, and I also used obviously the eyelash brush which we've got here. If you want to use these brushes, they can also be quite instructional in that you can examine the settings of the brushes. You can change the settings, play with them, and then just go back by clicking on the preset and pick the brush up again. You can also completely replicate what I did on the eye, as I'm going to supply the base file for it. So have fun painting!